Hi everyone and welcome to module number 2. In this module, we'll talk about gender-based violence and gender-based violence against women. And to do that, we'll use a PowerPoint presentation that you got it. Okay, so let's start. So in this module, you will be introduced to the terms gender-based violence and gender-based violence against women. And we'll answer some specific questions like, what exactly do these terms mean? How do they affect the lives of individuals and communities? And how do gender stereotypes that we discussed in Module 1 contribute to gender-based violence and gender-based violence against women? That means that at the end of this module, you will be able to answer the following questions like, what is meant with gender-based violence and gender-based violence against women? And what are the different kinds and forms of gender-based violence against women? How do gender stereotypes contribute to gender-based violence against women? And what kinds of consequences can gender-based violence and gender-based violence against women impact on individuals, communities, and the society? The term gender-based violence, according to the definition of Council of Europe, refers to any type of harm that is perpetrated against a person or a group of people because of their factual or perceived sex, gender, sexual orientation, and/or gender identity. However, it is important to understand that gender-based violence also includes threats of harm and instances of coercion and manipulation. Furthermore, according to the Istanbul Convention, gender-based violence is deeply rooted in the social and cultural structures, norms, and values that govern society, and it is often perpetuated by a culture of denial and silence. So to understand and learn more about it, we can have a look at this video below.
What is gender-based violence? Gender-based violence, or GBV, is one of the most common and widespread human rights violations. GBV is violence directed against someone on the basis of their gender or sex, which results in physical, sexual, or psychological harm. These acts violate an individual's human rights. GBV is most commonly perpetrated by men against women, girls, and other vulnerable people. However, men can also be victims of gender violence. Who are the perpetrators? Non-partner violence is violence inflicted by someone you do not know well, like strangers, acquaintances, or colleagues. However, violence is generally perpetrated by someone you are close to. This is known as interpersonal violence, which is perpetrated by either a friend or a family member. Intimate partner violence is perpetrated by someone you are in an intimate partner relationship with, a lover, spouse, or an ex-partner. What are the different types of violence? Physical violence is the intentional use of physical force or threats of violence. From a pinch to a punch, any act or threat of violence is damaging, whether the damage can be seen or not. Sexual violence is forcing, intimidating, or even tricking someone to engage in any sexual act against their will. Any sexual act with someone who is unable to understand what they're doing or is unable to consent because of their age, an illness, disability, or the influence of alcohol or other drugs is sexual violence. Forcing a lover or spouse to engage in sexual acts is a form of sexual violence, either called marital rape or intimate partner rape. Sexual harassment is also a form of sexual violence that can either be verbal or physical. It occurs in private and public spaces, such as schools, workplaces, in the streets, and on public transport. Economic violence involves denying a person access to their money, economic activity, or other basic needs by either controlling their finances or stopping them from achieving financial independence. All these forms of violence may lead to emotional and physical trauma. Emotional violence can also include verbal abuse, humiliation, and controlling what a person can and cannot do. Emotional and economic violence are as equally damaging and disempowering as sexual and physical violence. These types of violence are often misunderstood or ignored by people, even those we turn to for help, like the police, the courts, and other support structures. No matter who you are, where you live, or who is inflicting it, GBV is never acceptable.
So the message of this video is really important and clear. Gender-based violence is never acceptable. I hope that you enjoyed this video. So summing up then, gender-based violence is a human rights violation, includes psychological, sexual, physical, and economic harm, is underreported, can happen to anybody, is everyone's issue as it has many wide, complex, and often costly long-term effects on individuals, communities, and society as a whole. Thrives with silence, and again is everyone's issue and is never acceptable. Let's now give a definition of gender-based violence against women. That is a form of gender-based violence, is a worldwide phenomenon. And according to the Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, violence against women remains one of the most serious forms of gender-based violence of human rights in Europe, still shrouded in silence. Refers to a violation of human rights and a form of discrimination against women, and shall mean all acts of gender-based violence that result in or are likely to result in physical, sexual, psychological, or economic harm or suffering to women, including threats of such acts, coercion, or arbitrary deprivation of liberty, whether occurring in public or in private life. It is a violence that is directed against a woman because she's a woman, or that affects women disproportionately. The term woman, women, includes girls under the age of 18. Below, you can find the Istanbul Convention. Let's have a look at Article 3. So here you have the definition that we already read together, and it's really important because it talks about domestic violence, and that means all acts of physical, sexual, psychological, or economic violence that occur within the family or domestic unit. And the violence between or current spouses or partners, whether or not the perpetrator shares or has shared the same residence with the victim. Gender shall mean the socially constructed roles, behaviors, activities, and attributes that a given society considers appropriate for women and men. And again, gender-based violence against women shall mean violence that is directed against a woman because she's a woman. This is really important to understand, or that affects women disproportionately. Victim shall mean any natural person who is subject to the conduct specified in points A and B. And women, of course, includes girls under the age of 18. I suggest you to read all the convention because it's a very, very important tool. So gender-based violence is violence committed against someone because of their gender expression and gender identity. Patriarchy is the root cause of gender-based violence. Violence against women and girls is one form of gender-based violence. Whilst women and girls are often at the most risk of acts of gender-based violence, Gender-based violence also impacts boys, men, and people from sexual and gender minorities. Gender-based violence can take form in many different ways. Some of these will be discussed in more detail later on this module and includes form of physical, sexual, psychological, and economic harm. Unfortunately, most cases of gender-based violence go unreported, and their effects are most often long-lasting with wide and costly sociocultural roots and impact. Some commonplace reasons behind not reporting an act of gender-based violence can include factors such as victim does not recognize it as a violence. Some acts of psychological violence may be very difficult to recognize, especially when the victim has been groomed to accept certain acts as normal. For example, in the case of sexual abuse victims, or when acts of verbal abuse, hate speech, and psychological manipulation have developed slowly over time and the victim has grown used to it. The example are many cases of domestic and intimate partner violence. Being fearful of the consequences of reporting violence. Reporting gender-based violence against women could have serious financial consequences to the victim, as in the case of many women and mothers who are financially dependent on their husbands or partners, or being fearful of not being believed, as is often the case with victims of sexual abuse. Survivors of gender-based violence against women may also be ashamed of themselves and blame themselves for letting it happen to them unjustly, which can then result in not seeking help and not sharing their story with others. And sometimes it's too late. The act of violence are resulted in fatality, for example, as in cases of femicide. Gender-based violence takes place across every section of society, in the public as much as in the private, and includes prolonged and repeated acts of violence, harm, and their threat. This structural nature of gender-based violence against women is rooted in a patriarchal social system of power relations that assigns power to men, devalues women and girls, supports this asymmetry in the power relations between men and women, and the subordination of women. For this reason, the promotion of gender equality is crucial, important to the prevention of the combating of gender-based violence against women. To understand what the term patriarchy refers to and how it functions, watch the following video below.
Patriarchy is a word that scholars, and in particular feminist scholars, use to describe the ways that the world is organized by ideas about gender, and in particular ideas about men and women. Patriarchy says that men should be in charge and women should follow along and do what men want to do. And so there are lots of ways that patriarchy shapes our lives. I think one of the most clear examples of patriarchy is kind of the idea of the family or the idea of the marriage. And so inside the word patriarchy is the Latin root pater, which means father. And in a patriarchal family, the father is at the top of the family structure. So the father's in charge, maybe the mother's up there, but she's kind of following along, and then the kids are down below. And so that kind of structure might get replicated in lots and lots of other institutions. So if the little family, single unit of the family is patriarchal with the dad on top and the mom underneath kind of following along, then a patriarchal institution that's not the family would look the same way. So a patriarchal government structure would say the men should lead and the women should follow along. When the late 18th century, when the United States was founded, we had a patriarchal government structure because women couldn't vote. So the men could lead, the men could tell the women what to do, and the women had no voice. They couldn't vote, they had no choice really but to follow along. Other structures like that might be like businesses or work environments in which the men are the bosses and the women are fulfilling other kinds of duties that are also important but are not valued as highly. So we sometimes see patriarchy through the structure itself, and sometimes we see patriarchy through the kinds of practices that happen in the place. So you might see a situation in which it seems from the outside like the men and the women all have the similar kinds of jobs and similar amounts of power in the space. But if the men actually get to do whatever they want, and the women kind of have to tolerate bad behavior or tolerate being called names or things like that, then even though it looks from the outside like everything's hunky-dory, actually it's a patriarchal structure because the men still have more power than the women.
Coming up, gender-based violence and gender-based violence against women take place in every section of the society, takes place in both public and the private, affects everyone regardless of social class, race, ethnicity, religion, sex, and gender identification. Structurally, women and girls suffer disproportionately of gender-based violence, has often different and long-lasting effects, impact not only individuals but their families, communities, and society, includes often multiple types and forms of violence, is a serious public health issue and a human rights violation. Let us now introduce a very important issue for recognizing violence, forms of violence. Physical violence includes all acts that cause or want to cause pain and or physical injury. As with all forms of violence, the main purpose of the author is not only to cause physical pain, but also to limit the self-determination of the other. Physical violence can include acts such as beating, burning, kicking, punching, biting, or killing, and includes the use of objects and weapons. Witnessing physical violence can be just as traumatic as experiencing it directly. For example, children witnessing physical abuse at home can lead to serious psychological harm, intergenerational trauma, and further acts of violence. Sexual violence includes all acts of violence not consensual. In addition, marital rape and attempted rape constitute sexual violence. Furthermore, sexual violence includes sexual harassment at the workplace, sexual violence as a weapon of war and torture. Psychological violence is a form of violence that destroys the dignity of a person. Some examples of psychological violence include intimidation, verbal violence, confinement, or isolation. Socioeconomic violence is both a private as well as a public issue. In the public sphere, socioeconomic violence is both a cause and an effect of dominant gender power relations in societies. It may include denial of access to education or equally paid work, denial of access to services, exclusion from certain jobs, denial of pleasure and the enjoyment of civil, cultural, social, and political rights. In private life, it includes behaviors that tend to produce economic dependence, the control of the woman's salary or family income, preventing her from making any decision on it, obligation to leave work or not to find one, Socioeconomic deprivation can make a victim more vulnerable to other forms of violence and can even be the reason why other forms of violence are inflicted. In the two videos below, you will learn more about the forms of violence. So let's have a look at the first one.
Globally, 1 in 3 women and girls worldwide have experienced physical or sexual violence during their lifetime. Less than 40% of them seek help of any sort, and of these, only 10% seek support from police. And of all women who were victims of homicide worldwide in 2012, 50% were killed by intimate partners or family members. This situation cannot be overlooked. And although progress has been made, the end of violence against women and girls is far from today's reality. UN Women is committed to this cause and works with governments, national actors, women's organizations, and the civil society to end violence against all women and girls. The international community recently agreed that ending violence against women and girls is an important target for a sustainable future and a crucial matter to achieve the SDGs. During this process, we must make sure that we reach the lost woman. By its presence in more than 85 countries on all world regions, UN Women actively contributes to making this possible. We support countries in many ways, including adopting, implementing, and evaluating comprehensive laws and policies, addressing the root causes of violence through prevention strategies, and working with communities to change the social norms. Ensuring that essential services and support are accessible to all survivors. collecting data and conducting analysis to fully understand the nature and extent of the problem. UN Women envisions a world where all women and girls are equal and empowered members of society, free of all forms of discrimination and violence by 2030. But let's not wait until then. Let's act now. We need your help and commitment to make sure that we reach the last woman. Together we can make it happen. If not now, when? If not you, who?
That's so true. Together we can make it happen. I hope that you enjoyed this second module, and we'll see for the third one. Bye.